So we've seen from just the polling questions a little bit about the potential for this technology to be used in conservation. And I really want to get into a conversation here about what are the potential risks and benefits of doing that, and what are the potential risks and benefits of not doing that. I also want to just amplify something that Michael said about listening to the other side and remind people that that's just not an issue of civility, it's also an issue of personal gain. Probably the most you're going to get out of this conference is by hearing something that you didn't already know or agree with in the beginning. So when you feel yourself tightening up and wanting to fight with someone, that's the signal that you're about to learn something. So I'd really like to make this a conversation and get into the details of what everybody has to say here. We have a spectrum of very different beliefs and opinions up here to discuss something that's fairly polarizing. And there's a tendency in these debates to turn people into cardboard cutouts, pro and anti-caricatures. And to try and resist this as much as possible, because I believe that these people here, while with different values, are sincere in their effort to make the world a better place. I'd like to start off by having you each just say quickly, in 30 seconds or less, who you are and what values have driven you to the stage today. And this is not, in the previous panel, everybody sort of gave their distillation of their views. I promise we're going to get to that and hash that out. I'd really just like you to tell me, quickly who you are and what drives you. So maybe we'll just go.
Thank you. My name's Jim Thomas. I work for an organization called etc. Group. We're a civil society organization. We work internationally, been around about 40 years. And essentially, we track developments in new technologies. We track corporate strategies, particularly corporate concentration, especially around food, agriculture, biodiversity. And we're trying to really understand how new technologies, corporate concentration impacts on the most marginalized people and on biodiversity. And that's kind of the answer to your question is, what drives me to the stage is a history of looking at how powerful technologies introduced into an unequal society, or a society where we're seeing all sorts of erosion and destruction processes, often exacerbate and accelerate that. And here we have an exceedingly powerful technology, and we have to be exceedingly careful.
Right.
And I'm Ryan Phelan, and I'm the founder and CEO of an organization called Revive and Restore. And we'll talk about that later. But in terms of what drives me, I started my career in healthcare as an advocate for consumer choice. And I think I'm still on that bent in a funny way. After running a personalized medicine company, I was the first to do DNA direct and medical genetics. I saw the power of genetics, and I saw how people having the ability to choose whether or not just to get a genetic test, how different that could make their lives and their families' lives, and very pertinent to CRISPR because this was before CRISPR, and now we're just at another extension of that. But when I left that company after selling it, I wanted to use that information and what I learned in genomics and apply it to conservation, to what might be referred to as ecological health. And that's where I am today, and you'll hear more.
Excellent.
Thanks. I am Simon Stewart. I work for an organization called Synchronicity Earth in London. But that's not really the reason why I'm here. I've engaged on this topic of gene editing, synthetic biology, and conservation through my involvement with IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which is going to be starting an assessment and policy process on the intersection between these new technologies and conservation, the risks and the potential benefits. I've drawn into this particular topic because for a whole set of species around the world with which I've been engaged, we're running out of options. Conventional, we lack the technologies for saving large numbers of species from extinction with the technologies we've used to date.
And Aroha.
Kia ora everyone, greetings. My name is Aroha Mead and I'm from the Ngāti Awa and Ngāti Pro Māori tribes from New Zealand. And I come into this meeting with past experience in terms of some of the processes that Simon just referred to with IUCN. But in terms of the values that I have as a Māori woman, I was born into this world with ancestral directions, and those were that I should not do anything in this generation that will harm the heritage of future generations, and in fact that I should do everything I can to enhance the heritage of future generations. So I've been brought up in that system, and that means that I, along with a lot of other Indigenous people, tend to have a wide brief in terms of the issues that we look at, because we're not looking necessarily at the specifics, we're looking at the context in which they play out.
So Simon, maybe we could start with you. How might CRISPR be applied in conservation?
So that's a huge question. I should edit. I should start by saying I'm not a geneticist. I've been learning a huge amount here. It's been a huge privilege to be invited here. We actually held a consultation in IUCN in Bellagio in Italy. Ryan and Aroha were there nearly 2 years ago, I guess, to look at this question. Some of these questions were sort of addressed in the previous panel a bit, because some of the ideas are out there, which are perhaps slightly tangential to what we're going to discuss here, is the potential role of these technologies in the food production system. Because with a growing human population and with legitimate aspirations for much of humanity to have a much better lifestyle than they have at the moment, then we have no option but to grow more food on less land with less water and chemical inputs and sequestering more carbon. And current technologies will probably prevent us from doing that. So that's one side of the issues. I'm not an expert at all in that area, but it's sort of a bit obvious that that's going to have to be looked at. The other potential issues that I've been involved in, and this is not a comprehensive answer, is starting a conversation, really. We're not even exploring whether or not some of these technologies could be used to save species that are at risk from, for example, novel diseases. In the last 20, 30 years, we had a whole set of emerging infectious diseases hit amphibians, hit bats, hit reptiles, hit corals, and we do not have the time to figure out how to deal with these species and save them in the wild unless we come up with new solutions. So that's another one. And then the whole area of invasive species, and some of these diseases are probably invasive anyway, but we've never been very good in conservation at controlling invasive species on continents. Sometimes we can manage them on islands if they're small. So whether there are applications there. People have dreamt up other applications which I am much less personally persuaded by, such as synthetic rhino horn to flood the Chinese market with rhino horn and stuff like that. Very bad idea, I think. But I've given you a few ideas.
Yeah. So let's get to agriculture later. But in terms of using this technology to modify species that are out there in the wild and are threatened, how do you feel about these applications, Aroha?
Well, I'm not going to give a personal view because I'm still undecided. But what I will say is that I come from an ocean voyaging people, and there's everything to suggest that my ancestors didn't take to the oceans because they were escaping something. They took to the oceans because they were genuinely curious about the world, and they loved exploring. And I think we're still very much like that as a people now. So we look at things, but we look at things with a very wide set of criteria around how we assess risks and benefits. So when we're looking at an intervention for a species, for instance, we wouldn't just look at that species, we'd look at the relationship that species has with its ecosystem, with other species. We'd also look at the impact that it would have on our artists who might be using parts of it, if it's a plant, parts of a plant for weaving. We look at the relationship in terms of prayers that we have, art forms that we have, music that we have. So we're looking at it through a social, cultural, and environmental lens. And it takes us a little bit longer to consider things. And it also takes us a little bit longer to articulate what our views might be. But I think we'd also suggest that perhaps that's what is needed in a more broad sense in society. So I don't know, because I haven't seen enough one way or the other to tell me if this is a priority and this is going to make such a big difference that's different to human intervention or changes in human behavior.
And Jim, what about you in terms of taking on individual species or invasive species?
So Simon laid out I'm going to go back a little bit and then I'll answer your question. Simon laid out two areas in which a discussion could happen. One is, what are the risks of introducing new species? And the other is, can we create apps that we can use in conservation? There's a third, which is that as this industry builds around CRISPR and we have a set of products coming up, we begin to change our economies, that's going to have very real effects on the real world, on biodiversity, on land use, on flows of materials and trade, and all of those also need to be assessed. So I actually think there's the three things.
So changing economies as well as just agriculture.
Yeah, not just agriculture. We'll come to agriculture, but fundamentally, what this discussion is about is changing the economy. It's a change that's already begun with other biotechnologies, but this CRISPR is going to accelerate that, and we have to consider what that change in economy means for our physical world, for the biodiversity on that world, for the people who look after that biodiversity, who steward it. And I think the practice of conservation has changed and is contentious in many ways, but increasingly the discussion in conservation is about community-based conservation that comes from indigenous, local, traditional values, knowledge. It's kind of what Aroha was describing. Does that way of protecting and defending biodiversity sit well with these kind of external inventions coming from a lab somewhere in Berkeley or Harvard? The best ways to try and steward and defend our world often come from the very place, from the knowledge of the people who live there.
Mm. Ryan, so we've been doing conservation for a long time, and we have a lot of tools for protecting species. So what's wrong with just doubling down on those tools that are tried and tested?
I think for the last 5 years, I've been convening scientists, social scientists, as well as genome engineers and conservationists, trying to bridge this really information divide there between the people who are just in a lab working and the conservationists and the stewards that are on the ground. And what I can tell you is that there are some problems that are so intractable, and Simon has done a good job quickly running a list of them down to you, but I think I'll just take one as an example, because I think part of what this conference has been lacking is a bit of the details, the weeds, so that we're always at this very theoretical level.
I love the weeds.
So I'm going to run into the coral with you, because as soon as you talked about the ocean, Aroha, I thought, this is something for your people to really be thinking about in your neck of the woods, in New Zealand in particular, the loss of the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef and corals worldwide are being wiped out at a rate that even last year they couldn't believe could get worse, and it did. And it did for lots of reasons, from overfishing, from pollution and agricultural runoff, but mostly from water temperature. And we don't see that changing. Now, what's really interesting is that there are some corals in some parts of the world that are actually doing okay. I don't think scientists really say flourishing, but they're doing better, and they're showing resilience. And so this next month in Australia, I'm hosting a meeting called Engineering Resilience, bringing together these people who are, many of them from Australia and New Zealand, boots on the ground, scientists on the ground, trying to wrestle with, one, can you figure out what those genetic traits are and use something like CRISPR, some genome editing technique, to actually just knock back in some resilience that they lost that could help them adapt to temperature. Now, that would be a simple fix if possible.
So in other words, you see some of these corals that are adapted to heat, but if there were just those corals, there'd be this tremendous loss of all the other ones. So could you take that heat adaptation and give it to other
Exactly.
corals?
So you want to, obviously, in everything around conservation is about the protection of biodiversity. And so thinking through that, the scientists are actually looking at different ways to engineer in that one trait, or if that's what it is, so that others can withstand it. Now, it brings up, I see Jim is dying to get in here, but before he does, I want to just say that this does bring up, even for all the scientists, these huge issues of, well, who gets to decide how you adapt something that knows no boundaries, right? You know? But what are we going to do when you talk about risk with a species like coral that is the protection of 25% of all marine life, and that protects our shores from storms? And, you know, I mean, it's habitat. So at some point, we're going to, as a society, have to decide about those things that maybe you can't contain. Maybe it's not just getting rid of a rodent on an island, but it's actually about a species that has no boundary. And so to me, this is where the conversation has to go.
So Jim, you were shaking your head, and I should, if I really would like to make this a conversation, I'm sincere about that. So if you have something you'd like to say, signal to me, and
Yeah.
go ahead.
You know, so Tom on the last panel pointed out that we're in this new era, the Anthropocene. And this is what we're talking about, the politics of the Anthropocene.
Yeah.
The reason why the corals are dying is climate change, which is the Anthropocene, and we're talking about an Anthropocene fix. This idea, I think someone said, can we have a good Anthropocene? Can we be good Anthropocenesters? That's controversial. And you know, when obviously the reason I was shaking my head was, you know, here's a simple fix. No, there are no simple fixes, and you know.
I didn't say it was simple.
No, of course. And
Let the record show.
But you know, where the point about trying to address ecosystem preservation and biodiversity is its very complexity, and that complexity isn't even just a physical complexity of ecosystems, it's also the cultural complexity we were hearing about. It's why this topic is coming up at the Convention on Biological Diversity, where there's now been 7 years of, and it's really only just getting steam, of discussing how do you respond to both the threats and the opportunities of synthetic biology, gene editing, and everything that's coming down the pike. It's not simple, and what's potentially dangerous in this is to hold up single applications, single apps. Look, this could work, this could work. No, it's, you know, the lesson of ecology is you pick up anything, it's tied to everything else. So we have to have a conversation where we don't just hold up a sort of solutionist app and get excited about it. We have to talk about the bigger picture. We have to talk about it in a holistic way. That's challenging. You know.
Well, so the good news is conservationists are used to talking in whole systems and ecosystems.
Yeah, Simon.
Yes, so I'd like to say a word about the coral issue. So there is no simple fix on the coral issue, but if we go down the route we're going at the moment, we're facing ecological disaster in many parts of the world, because corals are the nurseries of some of the most important fisheries of the tropics. They are, along with mangroves, the main source of coastline protection. And they are, as Ryan said, I think you said 25% of the ocean species are in coral reefs. They're not actually the corals, but the species that live in coral reefs. There are 650 species of reef-building corals. So we've got reef-building corals and we've got other corals. 650 species of reef-building corals. They are not simple species, they're actually symbioses. They have living within them algae called zooxanthellae, and it's the response of those algae to temperature which causes the bleaching and dying of corals under the warming of ocean surface temperatures. But that pattern varies across the world. And you've got some places where zooxanthellae are more resistant to higher temperatures than others, and so is that areas of exploration. I don't know if genetic techniques are part of the solution for coral reefs. They might be, and I think they must be on the menu for us to look at, because the disaster we're staggering into is going to have huge impacts, not only for the loss of species, but also for the loss of livelihoods of people in the coastal tropics. So we have to look at all options. These genetic techniques may be part of the solution, they may not, but I would advocate strongly that they be looked at. And just as an aside on the point of communities, I take it that was made just a moment ago by Jim, I take it as a given that if we're going to take any of these applications and technologies to a conservation situation, that has to be done in a human community, local human community context.
Absolutely.
If you bounce it in from the outside, of course it will be rejected and won't work. That's a given. I don't think we need to negotiate that.
It would be nice to think that it's a given.
It's a given from
But
my,
there's
it's
a
a
lot
given
of
from my
education that has
perspective.
to happen
Yeah.
in the research community
Yeah.
before that becomes the reality.
But if I can just pick up briefly on this point of, as you're saying, you can very quickly focus in on the algae. We're talking about an open system here, and that's the issue if you're starting to talk about putting genetically modified organisms into the wild to change ecosystems. Algae is responsible for much of the oxygen we breathe. If you're going to start impacting on algae genetics and populations, what does that mean for oxygen levels? Hopefully nothing, but the complexity just keeps growing with these kind of...
Yeah.
So Jim, are you opposed to looking at, I'm not saying we should use these technologies, I'm a long way off that. I'm saying we should look at these technologies for corals. Are you opposed to that?
Well, not necessarily, but I think there's, putting it in the context of the Anthropocene, I think there's some very good lessons to bring over from what's happening at the moment in geoengineering, because this is somewhat similar. In this area of geoengineering where people are talking about growing more algae in order to draw down and so forth. The kind of questions that come up, the big questions of consent, which you just raised, questions about a moral hazard, as we begin to put energy and effort and money into these approaches, does that let politicians off the hook of real community-based conservation? There's that question. And then there's a question about technological lock-in, that as you begin to put money and time and research dollars and you begin to build an infrastructure around a development, that you also build a community who are committed to seeing that through, seeing it out in the environment, testing it the next step. We have to make some very early questions about are we ready to do this kind of large-scale experimentation with the wild, with biodiversity, with open ecosystems? And is that something we feel comfortable with? And then who's we?
And
who's
what
the we?
is wild?
Yeah, and wild, of course, is a question.
Wild to some
It's where people
is
live, actually.
completely normal to others.
Let's take another example, because I'm curious where your boundaries are, Jim, and obviously my fellow panelists. Let's take the example of avian malaria in Hawaii. So this is a condition that is absolutely threatening the remaining wild birds of Hawaii. As the mosquito, which is an invasive species, continues to move up the mountain with climate change, and it's already happening, the birds of the forest there that are endemic only to Hawaii are now disappearing.
Yeah.
They're succumbing to malaria. And the only hope right now is to bring those birds into captive breeding facilities with the hope that something will change. And they're actually doing that. They're actually removing some of the last populations of some of these birds. Now, avian malaria should not be in Hawaii. These insects came, and we have only one that is carrying this particular pathogen. There's 6 total mosquitoes in Hawaii. Now, to backtrack on this, over the last year, Hawaii, and Jim, you've been part of it, has been talking about using different genome engineering technologies, and there's 2 or 3, and we don't need to get into the weeds on it. Some may use CRISPR, some may not. But the question is, do we have a right as stewards, or do we have a moral obligation as stewards to remove these mosquitoes that not only carry avian malaria, but also carry other pathogens like Zika and chikungunya? And so these mosquitoes carry no value in the food chain. Nobody is dependent upon them. And humans don't like them. So, and the birds are dying from it. So I bring this up to say, at what point do we intervene? The mosquito shouldn't be there. And these technologies are humane. This is not with rodenticide. This is just creating forced sterility, is a way of thinking about it. So, comments?
Sure.
Yes, so this is a much more defined issue than the coral one. The coral one is massive.
Exactly.
And it's global. And the role of different technologies to deal with it are hard to get your head around. And the risks that Jim advocated are not theoretical, they're real. So that's huge. This is a much more defined one. It's on very, very isolated islands in the Pacific. It's undoubtedly human caused. These mosquitoes are brought in by whaling boats in the 1840s or something like that. It was only relatively recently that we discovered that the extinction of the land birds of Hawaii, most of them already extinct, was caused by avian malaria. We've just left with a very small number of species remaining now. And we will lose probably almost all of them in the wild without the removal of the mosquitoes or the malaria parasite. So this, to me, seems like a much narrower thing. It's in a controlled landmass where I find it much easier to imagine that these sorts of technologies might be the answer, because we don't have any other options that I've heard of. Maybe someone can correct me on that. The interesting thing when we were all at our meeting in Hawaii last year, at the IUCN meeting there, was it was the communities asking for this because they'd run out of options, which I found very interesting.
Including the indigenous people.
Yeah. That was it. I mean, there were differences on that. But there were indigenous communities who were also very opposed to this, and who, they were saying, well, look, what I was hearing was the original invasive species that's a problem here are us. In fact, not the indigenous people. The people who came to Hawaii, cleared large parts of land, set up large industrial monoculture agriculture. That's what's created the situation where these birds have retreated to these little islands of, what are basically the mountains that are left, and then with climate change are now pretty endangered.
So
that's a historical
how
situation.
did they want to solve it? Were they going to let the birds go?
Yeah, so the question, what I was hearing from indigenous communities we were talking with, and so these are complex discussions, is they needed to face this. They needed to face this and discuss it and work out what is the appropriate way from their own traditions, knowledge, and maintaining control over the solution to address this problem, this matter, the birds matter. But to have a group of scientists who were flown in with a certain amount of money to be toured around and told them here's a savior solution to their problem didn't feel right.
So,
this is, generally speaking, we're talking about complex, urgent problems. And in the face of complex, urgent problems, you don't make quick decisions. You slow down and
Jim,
you think carefully.
I've got to do some fact correction here. First of all, the people in Hawaii have been dealing with this. There's, everything from the groups of Audubon, the Nature Conservancy in Hawaii, and the United States Fish and Wildlife, USGS. They've been tracking this problem. These are committed local residents of Hawaii, including indigenous people, who are facing this problem. And they have asked for help. And they asked Revive and Restore to come in and look at genomic solutions. So that's why I actually know something about this, is because they needed to reach out. Now, at the same time, the group that is going to be doing the genome engineering for the very first trial is being developed through the University of Hawaii. And I think you met some of the individuals there, partly because they want to make sure that this is not just science being flown in elsewhere or companies, corporations elsewhere solving their local problems. But what's interesting about conservation that's so different than food and medicine is that there's no big corporate interest here. Nobody makes money in conservation. And hence, actually, nobody wants to fund it. So the drivers, and I know a lot of what Et Cetera has done has been to fight corporate interests for whatever reason, but it doesn't play well in conservation. And to put species at risk because of those threats, I think, is really morally questionable.
So I think what I'm hearing from you is the bigger concern is the genie getting out of the bottle and having impacts in other ways. I wonder if you can just summarize, like, what are your concerns, and maybe Aroha, you might have some thoughts about this as well, about transformation of economies. And you touched on this, but if you have any specific, that would be good.
Well, I mean, just to the Hawaii situation, I mean, we should name the fact that what was under discussion there were gene drives. And I think this is probably the part of the program we're going to discuss gene drives.
Okay.
So we'll come back to
Let me define them real quickly. For anybody who doesn't know, this is a naturally occurring phenomenon where a gene ensures that it's passed on to all or the overwhelming majority of its offspring. And so the gene and its traits are spread very quickly through a population. And now CRISPR scientists have managed to harness gene drives through editing, and CRISPR, this isn't the only potential tool, but perhaps the most controversial, because you have something that's out there doing gene editing really outside of the lab entirely and spreading this process.
Right. So, the promise of a gene drive from a technical point of view is that you can make a very small change at the genome level, release a single mosquito, a single mouse, and through a process of that being driven through a population, you can have a very large change across a population, or indeed change an ecosystem. It is for myself, the reason why I became extremely concerned about this, and others did too, is because it's probably one of the most high leverage technologies we have. It's similar to the nuclear chain reaction, the mutagenic chain reaction, which is what it was called by Ethan Beer, who did this, enables a technician to exercise tremendous control over space and time. That in effect, you think about Archimedes' lever, find me a place on the world and a long enough lever, I'll change the world. Well, in effect, this is putting that lever into that cracking creation that Jennifer Doudna points to and saying, well, we'll put the lever there and we're gonna change the world here. Now that level of power and the potential to do that quickly and who determines what gets done is frankly frightening. And however the power to roll out gene drives rolls out, it has to be done with the whole discussion about, one of the largest funders is the US military. Why are they one of the largest funders? What could that mean? Clearly, this is going to end up in agriculture. There's a lot of interest from agriculture companies in taking this. The discussion about gene drives cannot start with one or two carefully curated applications that are made to look like this is a good use. We have to have the whole discussion. It has to be done with everybody involved. So, part of the concern about coming to Hawaii and saying, we think we can release gene drives here in order to save this bird is like, well, this is not proportionate to the discussion that we have to have.
Do you want to respond to that?
Yes, I don't think anyone was just saying, can we release gene drives? So to be clear, the discussion was about understanding the application of these technologies and including the could and the should was part of the discussion. So I think everyone who's involved in these technologies where you're using such a sophisticated tool as CRISPR, for one thing, just a precise edit, and being able to drive that deleterious mutation through a population is concerned about potentially unintended consequences. And I think DARPA, in its largesse at putting $60 million into the ability to create a program called Safe Genes, which was just announced, I think probably last month, is really the only funder of this research. And I don't think it's to weaponize it as some people would like to think. It's really to understand the technology and to understand how to make it safe, which means you'd have to create potentially an undo button so that you release them and say you want those mosquitoes, that particular mosquito back on that island, you could go bring in another mosquito to replace it. Now, I don't think that's going to be as simple as an undo button, but there are a lot of, the funding of the 60 million is to actually use case studies, of which several of them are going to be in conservation. One with mosquitoes for both human health, potentially avian health, but the other one is to remove rodents from islands. Because as you know, the way that we do that now is with huge levels of rodenticides with significant off-target effects. So you know, at some point, Nate, I hope you come back to these risks and trade-offs, because it's really what it's about.
Aroha.
I just wanted to sort of expand a little bit this question about Indigenous people being present, because I think the term gets used quite loosely. A few Indigenous people in a meeting doesn't constitute Indigenous consent or dissent.
Yes.
And groups of people, like any part of society, have diverse views, and you have to be really careful about who is being invited into a conversation. So I'm here as an Indigenous person from Aotearoa, New Zealand, but there's over 6 million Native Americans and Inuit from Alaska resident in this nation. So my views wouldn't constitute the Indigenous perspective. It comes from my place. And I can't stress how important it is for people who are researchers, who are going into communities, to be really careful about how they organise the involvement and participation of Indigenous groups, to make sure that they get a cross-sectoral part, that they get youth, that they get elders. So I'm currently working on a project at home looking at Māori perspectives on gene editing. And I can just say from my initial sort of studies that there is no one view, there's multiple views. And what I've found is that the elders are more inquisitive than the youth, that the youth are actually very conservative and more likely to say no. But the elders want to tell stories, they want to tease out everything that's involved in the process and really understand it. And those are amazing conversations to be part of, that scientists who go into them come out of them, you know, richer for their experience. So, yeah, just we have to be careful about saying whether Indigenous peoples consent or dissent to something.
I want to talk directly about agriculture, but Simon first.
Well, just closing on the Hawaiian issue. So I think all four of us were at this huge IUCN Congress in Hawaii last year. There were masses of side discussions on this Hawaiian bird issue. None of us were in all of the discussions. I was only in one of them. I don't think any of these were decision-making meetings, and I don't think any stakeholder group gave consent to anything in those meetings. They were just sort of talking and just airing ideas. What I heard in the one meeting that I went to was quite strong antagonism from people in Hawaii, including Indigenous groups, that they felt they were being told by people from outside Hawaii that certain technologies could not be considered because they were too dangerous. And they wanted everything in discussion. They didn't want anyone telling them what they could and couldn't discuss. So while at the one hand you've got the risk of scientific communities coming and saying, we've got these great techniques, you should use them, it'll solve your problems, and all that coming in from the outside, you also have the opportunities of policy-oriented groups and lobby groups from the outside against those technologies. And I think both of those are dangers to avoid. They're all should be in part of the discussion, but I think the discussion needs to happen with the people in Hawaii.
So there's been some discussion of agriculture and how it relates to conservation in this conference already. And the basic idea is that, you know, agriculture is the biggest way in which we leave a footprint here on Earth. It takes up a lot of space. Agricultural land is generally fairly compromised for habitat for most species. And And the pattern that we've seen throughout history is that, Thomas Malthus, he had the math right, that we were going to finish clearing all the forests and farmland and starve, but he didn't consider that we find new ways to drive down the amount of land needed per person to feed ourselves. And there is, I think we're already seeing CRISPR innovations in agriculture for pest control and controlling food waste that might increase the amount of food that comes off each acre, or if not increase the amount that's available to people. So I guess to start with, let's ask this question. Who benefits and who suffers potentially from embracing or rejecting CRISPR in ag? Are there conditions in which it's acceptable or completely unacceptable? I just want to throw this out. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to start this off again.
Yeah, please.
I think we have to be very careful when we say, we quote Malthus and we say that agriculture is responsible for so much of taking up the Earth's resources and so forth. Agriculture, like indigenous people, is not a monotonous thing. There are different types of agriculture, and they have very different footprints. So, we have an industrial food chain that uses up 75% of the world's land and only feeds about 30% of the people. In that industrial food chain, something like about 23% of the calories ever get to human beings, and that's including the ones that go through meat. A lot of it goes to animals that doesn't get to people. A lot of it's wasted. A lot of the world's fresh water is being used up by that industrial food chain, and so is, it's destroying large amounts of forest land every year. At the same time, and this goes back to some of the discussion earlier about food sovereignty, what is actually feeding people is a peasant food web. That's, on only 30% of the land is feeding about 70% of the global population. It's doing so with very little footprint. So if you wanted to start the question, how are we going to reduce agriculture's impact, it's pretty straightforward. You look at the agriculture that already feeds people, that has very low footprint, that doesn't really affect climate change, and you put effort into that and you give back land to peasants. That's the way in which we can start addressing that. Does applying CRISPR to the industrial food chain make it better? It might, you could make arguments that the data would show that it could end up being more efficient, but it's never going to be as efficient in feeding people as the peasant food web.
Those statistics don't square with the statistics I'm familiar with, that 70% of the agricultural footprint comes from industrial agriculture.
Yeah.
Well, I'd be interested in it. I can't do a fact check right
I'll
at the moment.
I'll send it to you.
Yeah.
Etc. produces a report called Who Will Feed Us. We do this every few years and we update those statistics.
So the contention is that high labor, low technology agriculture produces more calories per acre, is better at feeding people than...
It's the reality of how most people feed themselves on this planet.
I agree with that.
And it has a low footprint. So if you're going to set up an agricultural system that feeds people and has a low footprint, that's where you start. You start with those local, traditional approaches. And then you have to adapt them for climate change. We are in a rapidly changing world, but you start with those processes. I don't think CRISPR is very appropriate to that. CRISPR is being applied, whether by DuPont or anybody else, towards large-scale monoculture industrial agriculture. That's not the system that's feeding people. That's not the system that's going to get us past our current problems.
Yes, Simon.
Yeah, well, it's true that a huge proportion, and I don't know the numbers, of the world feed themselves off peasant agriculture. That type of agriculture, and I've seen much of it across especially the tropical world, is also, just like indigenous people, just like agricultural generally, is not one type of thing. There are many types of peasant agriculture or subsistence agriculture. I think, again, we would have to talk to the people involved, but for many people, can they achieve the aspirations and the standard of living they want off that type of agriculture? I think not. In the places I've seen in India, very often not. So in other cases, maybe yes. So I think just to say that's all okay and we can leave that, I think a lot of people are involved in those activities because they have no choice. we all in this room, I think, enjoy very good standards of living compared with some of these people. So I think we have to be cognizant of those inequities that are out there in the world. I would, Nathaniel, though, I would contest one thing you said at the beginning here, though, is that this land for agriculture isn't of much use for biodiversity. Again, that's a very patchy thing. And in areas where agriculture is more ancient, especially in Asia, West Asia, and even in Europe, especially Southern Europe, where there's been more sort of coexistence between nature and agriculture over long periods of time, agriculture can actually be very important for biodiversity conservation, possibly in some other parts of the world as well. But so I think these are very, very complex issues, and agriculture is a huge driver of biodiversity loss, but it's not always an enemy. And so very complex issues again.
Noted. Other thoughts, Aroha?
Well, I think the way that agriculture is being used in this conversation is really looking more at large scale. But because I'm coming from a small country, I mean, agriculture in New Zealand is wonderful. It's the basis of most of our population's livelihood. And I come from farmers on both sides of my family. So, and it's not an either or for us. You can successfully engage in agriculture in a sustainable way. You can also ensure crop diversity. You can also contribute to soil health, and it's all about how you go about doing your farming. But I don't see it, well, I don't think it's perceived as much of an issue in our small place, because I don't know if any of you have ever been to New Zealand, but how many of you have been to New Zealand? So you all would have gone through Auckland International Airport or Christchurch and seen that we are the biosecurity capital of the world. There are announcements everywhere that you can't bring things in, and it's serious. That people get fined if they even bring an apple from the plane or leftover food, because we're so protective of our agricultural industry, because it's everyone's livelihoods. And it is part of the consciousness of all New Zealanders, I think, that you become really aware of what is happening when you bring something new in to systems that have proven to be successful as they are. Now, if my ancestors had a biosecurity policy right at the beginning, New Zealand would be a very different place and maybe wouldn't have as many invasive species as we have. But we've all learnt and grown in that way together. But yeah, I don't see that it helps things to categorise sectors as somehow being particularly damaging, because there's variations in everything, and there's scales as well.
Brian.
I think I could segue here to something very relevant to New Zealand, and I don't know how Aroha feels about this, but I think it might be important for our audience to hear, which is that as our country here in the US has become more and more anti-science, other countries are becoming very bullish on science. And Australia, New Zealand, China, and others are using, or potentially going to use, genome editing techniques, probably way before we do anything here in the US of significance. And I say that because New Zealand announced, I think it was last year, a very important initiative called Predator-Free 2050 New Zealand. And they want to get rid of possums, stoats, and weasels, and what else? Five?
5 species.
And they have said that there is no way to do this probably without genome editing. So how your country and how your culture is going to actually wrestle with this issue, the technologies are not there ready to deploy tomorrow. They have to be done in the lab. They've got to be studied. The unintended consequences have to become more identified. and resolved, and before it ever goes in the wild. But there are countries that are moving forward. Yeah.
But in that case, we have leading gene drive researchers like Kevin Esvelt, who are saying, please do not use global gene drives in this situation. They're writing very clearly, if New Zealand were to release rats,
And they
possums,
probably won't.
please do not. And the
And we
danger
don't
is that
need
it gets-
Kevin to tell them not to. They're probably not going
Yeah.
to.
But
And also, I mean, the predator-free 2050 is a target of a political party. We're about to go into election, and that political party isn't looking too healthy right now. And the consortium that will come in afterwards have already indicated that they're going to have issues with that. So we shouldn't be, don't see that as a given, that the approach to predator-free New Zealand will in fact include gene editing and other mechanisms, because we don't know. We just don't know. We haven't had the national conversation yet.
So I'd like to go to audience questions, but just to kind of sum up, I think what I've learned so far, that there's a tremendous desire to do things carefully and do things right and do things in consideration of communities that have historically been devastated by introduction of new technologies. At the same time, there's a recognition that we're on a sort of runaway sled here, that the actions of prior generations have not allowed us to do things conservatively and right. And there's a tension there between failing to take action to slow down the sled and taking action which may make things worse in some ways. So let me pull up the questions. We'll now pause while technology catches up.
I hope we have some tough ones from you guys.
Well, here we don't.
I can't see that. Let's have a look. I can't read it.
Okay, so we didn't talk that much about agriculture, but this first question has to do that. Countries with peasant food webs have rampant famine, starvation, and malnutrition. How can this be the solution?
How can what be the solution, sorry?
Peasant food webs.
Yeah, so I mean, the historical situation is that peasants, often in countries in the south, have been moved off the best land. Have been moved off the best land, do not have land rights or access to resources, and are basically trying to live on what are now called marginal lands, what's left, but do feed themselves, really do. And imagine if the large monoculture plantations were, the land was handed back. That's why you have movements like in Brazil, the movement Santel, who are trying to get back land. There's deep inequities around land and access to resources. That is why you have hunger. There was a question which I think is very important: does CRISPR make this worse? We're seeing traits being proposed, for example, that crops can move on to arid lands, that crops can move on to so-called climate-ready traits, which would mean that these marginal lands potentially could be colonized by monoculture systems. That would be another reason to move peasants off of land again. So until peasants have land title, until peasants have access to resources and have their human rights guaranteed, this is food sovereignty, then yes, they're fighting for their lives.
I just note that there's a lot of talk about when do we take technological risks and what technological risks are appropriate. If we're looking at political solutions, we need to talk about when it's appropriate to take political risks. Looking at land redistribution, these are big things that carry tremendous risk as well. And I think we should be having the same conversation. Yes, Stuart.
I think it's probably correct to say that where biodiversity conservation has been most successful worldwide, tropical or non-tropical, is where land tenure rights are secure and guaranteed by law. And you've even got neighbouring countries where you've got very different situations in that respect. So I think Jim touched on some important points there. I'm not certain what they have to do with CRISPR, but that's a very important context in which we have to operate. I still don't think that peasant agriculture is the solution to feeding the world, even if all those tenure problems could be sorted out. I think the sums simply don't work out, and especially in relation to human aspirations. Yeah. But there may be some parts of the world where it's important.
You know, I think the bridge that's closer to where wildlife, instead of looking at agriculture and its bridge to wildlife, I think it's really human health and its relationship to wildlife. Zoonotic diseases is a major issue worldwide. And whether or not we're going to start to tamper with wildlife in order to protect human health is a much more interesting conversation to me and a more substantive one for this particular panel, because I think we really do have people with expertise in this area as opposed to peasant agriculture. I think that you had mentioned Kevin Esvelt, and I'll bring it right down to using CRISPR technology. Kevin is a great scientist working in the Boston area and is looking at engineering the white-footed mouse, a native species, so that it can no longer carry any tick-borne pathogens. Now he's doing this in some of the most affluent communities of all, Nantucket Island and Martha's Vineyard, talking to the local residents about their tick-borne diseases and would they want to have anything engineered in their backyard. And I know Michael Spector mentioned this yesterday, but I think it's just an example of where you're starting to see public acceptance of using even the potential of a gene drive technology, although right now Kevin is not working on it. That gene drive, he is still working on other gene drive technologies for other projects. And I think that that society is much more open to that in that kind of situation where it impacts human health. So I just leave that up for discussion.
There's a number of questions here having to do, which I like a lot, about, so this phrasing, there's a lot of talk about talk, and we need to talk with everyone, and of course that's the right thing to say, that's the safe thing to say in this situation. But when does that talk turn to action on the moving sled? There's always uncertainty about environmental outcomes. When do we know enough to intervene? And it makes me, I think about these, there's so much words that are spilled in international conferences and conferences like this, and then often what happens, where these inflection points happen, where the world changes is when someone goes rogue, and I wonder if, how useful the talk is. So I guess two questions, I'm adding my own. One, is there a point where we can say, yes, this is enough, we should never use this, or we should use this particular application? And two, are we talking ourselves out of legitimacy or relevancy? Yes.
Compared with the panels we had earlier on medicine and agriculture, the conservation and environmental community is very, very far behind in its understanding of these issues. The majority of people in our communities, frankly, are not engaged or even aware of some of this conversation that we're having here. So we're a very long way behind. And so that's why we're in this situation of talking about talking, to be honest. And I can understand that frustration because I'm in a situation as somebody who's been leading species conservation networks for over 30 years of us dealing with hundreds of species for which we now have no conservation solution in the wild, and we are running out of time. But I'm still, and always have been, a huge believer in the stakeholder consultations and getting to consensus. And so, as you summed up just earlier, we're now in this trap, because we're so far behind, of having to have the conversations, and yet the time is running out for the species we care about, and by implication all the ecosystems and all the processes around them and the relationships of communities with those species. So we're not in a good place. We're very much on the back foot on these. And so I would say as a community in conservation, we're going to have to speed up our discussions, because we are, in the next relatively short space of time, going to be forced into decisions, or into non-decisions that are in fact decisions. Mm-hmm. So we'll decide to do nothing about the birds and kauri in Hawaii and lose them. It's a decision.
Yeah.
Jim.
Yeah, so I mean, let's put this in context. CRISPR is, 5 years old at most? Someone else probably tells me what it is. Gene drives are 2 years old, maybe. These discussions have been in the Convention on Biological Diversity for 7 years, preceding CRISPR, but they've now incorporated that. Time moves very slowly. Things move very slowly in the United Nations. But this need to have rapid societal dialogues and assessment of emerging technologies while the world around us is changing very rapidly isn't just for CRISPR. Yeah, we saw it in the conversation last night around artificial intelligence. It's true around a number of other things. And that points to a bigger question. We're in a world of accelerating technologies, accelerating external change, whether we call it the Anthropocene or not. And we now need new mechanisms by which we can evaluate in an inclusive way, and begin to take action around whether or not to use new technologies. Now, we have the beginnings of that. We have the UN has set up its Science, Technology, Innovation Forum and its technology facilitation mechanisms. It's 2 years old. It's the beginning of an international governance structure for doing that. I think we need a new international governance structure on biotechnology, actually. That's talking about international governance structures is the sort of thing that puts people to sleep, and certainly in this country, people aren't very fond of it. But given the challenge, the scale of the external challenges and the scale of which our technologies are arriving, we need new institutions. So that's the conversation we need to have.
I want to really push back on that, because although that sounds great, we need new energy, new interests, new minds thinking about these technologies. I'm all for that. But in terms of the regulation, we heard that on the last panel from Friends of the Earth saying, we need new mechanisms to deal with genome engineering. We need new regulations. Well, I think, the one thing that we do have is we do have policies and procedures. We have environmental assessment reports. We do have mechanisms for this stuff in conservation. And I want to go back, 30 years ago when Friends of the Earth actually said when the last 12 condors were going to disappear from the sky, David Brower here in Berkeley said, let them die with dignity. Because we don't know how to breed condors in captivity. It would be a crime against nature. And today, we have 400 condors, and anyone who's seen a condor in the wild will never forget it. I think it's 400 total and 200 in the wild, and they're breeding in the wild. And they've done it with the use of technology. They've used genomics to understand and how to do better breeding and mate pairing. They could use genome engineering one day to get rid of its one deleterious mutation that is unique to this bottleneck population of condors. But they're in the sky again. And it was a lot of naysayers who said, we shouldn't use technology, we shouldn't intervene with nature. And we can go through species after species that all of us look up in the sky and see peregrines all across the East Coast that disappeared with DDT are back. Because these scientists went against all odds to bring these species back. And God knows there are cross hybrids of peregrines and everything else out there. But they did it with great dissension and controversy. But they went through, U.S. Fish and Wildlife and others, going through and saying, let's do an EA report, let's get public consent, let's try it and see what we can do. And we can always bring them back into captivity. We know how to do it. So I worry about paralyzing the innovation that we need to have by just planting our heels and say, we need whole new bodies to do this. We have the capacity to reach.
So we're just about out of time, and Rojo, I see you jotting things down, so I want to give you a chance to comment on this, or and everybody else quickly, if there's anything else that you wanted to say that you haven't had a chance to say.
Well, just getting back to our topic about the wild, I just wanted to say I think it's really important. Somebody asked a question about what were the stopping and starting points. That first of all, we have to ask the people who are going to be most impacted upon, and that usually will be local communities, and where there are Indigenous people, it'll be Indigenous people, and make sure that they're in the room, at the table, and just an intrinsic part of the entire process, because they're really the only ones who can give a considered view. And for people who live outside, so in my case, I'm not going to comment on what's happening in Hawaii, because there's an active population of Indigenous Hawaiians, and that those are their ancestors, and that's their responsibility. Whatever decision they come up with, all the rest of us will live with it. But we have to keep it at the local level, and it's really important to make sure that those most impacted are there throughout all stages and bring them along in the journey. But I also think that often the questions that are being asked of people are too narrow. So if you go in and ask, should gene editing be used for the situation in Hawaii, but not look at the broader issue of what is on the menu, what is on the menu, for want of a better word. What are all the options? And given all these options, which is the one you want to go with? That conversation, you will get hundreds of community people involved in. But if you ask them, this is the only option that we're going to talk about here, they'll be less interested. So it's all about being open to every part, every solution, every possible solution.
Many thanks to Nathaniel Johnson and this last environment panel. Appreciate it.